Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I didn't plan to live on a fishing trawler. I shipped out on the Marlin's Pride because I needed work and because the water was simple compared to the noise on land. The boat was a 105-foot steel-hulled stern trawler built in the late 1990s. Single Caterpillar main engine, 2 diesel generators, a hydraulic winch system that could groan the way old ships do when they're honest about their age. We worked out of Ilwaco at the mouth of the Columbia River and ran north and south depending on quotas and weather. Our captain, Helen O'Rourke, was from Newport, Oregon, the kind of skipper who corrected course with 2 fingers and never raised her voice. I signed on as deckhand and electronics tech, which meant I spooled nets, cleaned fish, patched broken sensors, and kept the radar and AIS talking to each other when the river fog turned the world into a blank sheet. The day the epidemic truly hit, we were 50 miles off the Washington coast south of Grays Harbor. It was a flat morning with a low swell and visibility to the horizon. The radio on VHF Channel 16 sounded like it does on holiday weekends. Constant traffic, half of it stepped on by someone else. We were hauling our second trawl of the day when the first mayday came across, a small voice repeating the word collision and then cutting out. That happens. Boats bump each other. But then we heard a US Coast Guard broadcast for a vessel barricaded inside the Westport Marina office, requesting assistance with a violent crowd. Then another noticed that the Coast Guard station was suspending routine operations due to a public safety emergency. That never happens, not like that. The sky was bright, and the deck was wet with seawater and fish scales, and the radio sounded like someone had taken the lid off the coast. We pulled the nets aboard and spread the catch. The crew was 8 that trip. Captain Helen in the wheelhouse, First Mate Jim Park at the plotter, able to find fish the way some people find Wi-Fi, Engineer Dima Kovalenko, who could hear a bearing a day before it failed, Sarah Patel, a nurse from Portland who joined as a medic because the company finally learned that having a medic at sea wins insurance discounts, deckhands Luis and Miguel Flores, brothers who could splice a line by feel, me, and a greenhorn named Tyler, who still got his wrists tangled in the rubber gloves when he tried to gear up fast. We each stopped what we were doing every time the radio spoke. Not because we wanted drama, because mariners listen. By noon, we had NOAA weather on the HF set and a scratchy AM news station out of Astoria giving updates that didn't make sense. It wasn't a takeover or a riot, not exactly. The words changed with each hour. Aggressive illness, disturbed persons, emergency departments overwhelmed, law enforcement stretched thin. There were advisories to shelter in place and then contradictory advice to seek assistance at designated centers. It sounded like the way bad weather comes. Warnings, then watches, then someone on a microphone whose voice is too careful. "Stow the catch, we're heading in," Captain Helen said. Her tone told us it wasn't for the fish buyer's schedule. "Mate, plot for Westport. We'll check the bar conditions." We turned north toward the Grays Harbor bar. The AIS showed fewer targets than usual. Dima drifted between the engine room and the galley, counting gallons in his head. We hit the outer approach buoy in late afternoon and saw smoke inshore. Thin grey columns that could have been brush fires, or boat fires, or both. Over the bar, we saw the Westport breakwater packed with cars and people. There were boats trying to leave, boats trying to enter, and a pileup of small craft jammed against the docks where they shouldn't have been. A harbour master's skiff idled near the mouth and then ran aground on the inside shoal, the operator stepping off and wading to the rocks as if that was the plan. "Port's no good," Jin said, without turning away from the binoculars. "Ilwaco?" I asked. "Same story last I heard," Sarah said. She had a small public safety scanner app on her phone and kept reading fragments. Hospital on diversion. Security incidents in the parking lot. We swung wide, stayed outside, and paused dead in the swell, while everyone looked at the captain. It wasn't mutiny. We were a crew, and she was the skipper, but everyone on deck was quiet and waited for one voice to choose between two different kinds of risk. "Back offshore for the night. We'll try Astoria at first light," Helen said. "We conserve fuel from here, night lighting to red deck lights only. Everyone eats now and rests in turns. No shore contact unless expressly ordered." We went back out. The sea didn't care about any of it. That night, with the radar range at 12 miles and the AIS painting erratic tracks, we ate rice and canned tuna in the galley and listened. The Coast Guard updated its broadcast. Shelter in place shifted to avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Public safety units requested citizens to remain indoors. A recorded voice from the State Emergency Office said public services were degraded. The next morning, before dawn, we tried the Columbia entrance. The Columbia River bar looks like a regular river mouth on a map. On the water, even on a calm day, it's a puzzle box. You follow the ranges and the buoy line, and you read the water surface. That morning, we could see fires on the Washington side and smoke that ran flat across the river like low cloud. The bar pilots weren't answering the radio. We didn't need a chart update to understand that a boat isn't a refuge if the dock you tie to is a target. We stayed outside and burned circles all day while the crew argued in ways we wouldn't have bothered to argue a week ago. Should we run north to Near Bay and hope for help? Should we go south for Coos Bay where someone knew someone? Should we run for open water and buy time? Every plan spent fuel, and fuel now felt like blood, but we still had to make a plan. It became clear by the third day that the problem on shore wasn't just crowds. The scanner chatter from counties up and down the coast went from disjointed to strained, then to nothing. The HF set caught a brief Coast Guard command broadcast acknowledging personnel casualties and discipline issues. Channel 16, which normally has a tone to it, businesslike, short, broke into longer calls and sobbing, and then as if someone put a pillow over the world's mouth, it went mostly quiet except for weather. We tried once more to get fuel. We approached Tillamook Bay on low tide because the bar is calmer then, and we ran up to the outer breakwater. On the inside of the North Jetty, on the rocks, I saw 3 figures waving rags. I didn't wave back. On the south side, a cluster of people moved along the riprap with the stop-start gate I now recognized. After watching enough of the television clips loop over and over, we didn't go in. I wanted to, because the faces on the rocks were faces and not noise. I kept the binoculars up until my eyes watered, and the captain said, "Mateo, put them down." We stayed at sea. Fuel gauges narrowed the circle of what we could do. We stopped using one generator, except for short windows. We cut night lighting down to almost nothing. On day 4, Dima and I started sketching a distillation rig that didn't care whether the parts were fashionable. We had spare drums, copper tubing, and an engine room that produced more waste heat than we liked on hot days. We built a small desalination still that could boil seawater in a sealed drum and run the condensated along copper coils through a saltwater bath to cool it before it dripped into food-grade containers. It wasn't pretty or efficient like a commercial reverse osmosis unit, but it kept us from depending entirely on bottled water and the small freshwater tank. We lashed the drum, ran the coils along a plate we fixed to the hull where seawater flowed by, and watched the first slow trickle of clear drops like people watch rain in a drought. After an hour, it turned into a steady line. We tasted it with test strips and then drank. Food wasn't the immediate problem. We were a fishing boat, but the catch we had iced down wasn't meant to sustain us for weeks. We needed fuel to run the brine freezer, and we needed to fish to keep our stores up. The day after we postponed Tillamook Bay, we dropped a net in calm water and brought up enough to keep protein on the stove for a week. We didn't think about money. The company wasn't answering anyway. From then on, the sea was our town, and the boat was our address. Roles settled into something like a watch bill. Captain handled navigation and decisions. Jin ran the plotter, radar, and AIS like a chessboard. Dima tuned the engine and dabbled with our makeshift water still and any other contraption that could convert one kind of fuel into another. Sarah ran sick call and triage drills, taught us how to use the medical gear better than guessing. I kept radios alive and repaired whatever the sea tried to eat. Luis and Miguel were deck muscle, but better than that. They were calm and could lift morale the way they lifted lines. Tyler learned how not to break his thumb under a combing and how to coil hose clockwise. We turned our bright ship into a dim ship. At night, we ran without deck floods, only red lights inside. That first week, we learned that light is a signal on open water, and signals can draw what you can't manage. We also learned that voices carry over flat seas, so we stopped working out our differences on the deck. Around day 8, the wind shifted south and brought a front that turned into the kind of early summer storm that seems embarrassed to exist. The swell built and the wind pushed whitecaps into sloppy chop. We were running north of Cannon Beach when we picked up a weak AIS target that winked in and out at 3 miles, then 5, then 3. It didn't broadcast a vessel name. We altered to avoid, but it altered too. And at 2 miles, the target still didn't identify. We heard no radio call. I went topside with binoculars and saw the low silhouette of a small aluminum workboat, the kind harbours use for towing docks. It was riding low and showed no navigation lights. When it was half a mile off the bow, it turned and ran alongside our course, close enough for me to see figures at the console. They were not wearing life jackets, and the boat's stern looked crowded with gear or bodies. I couldn't tell which. I didn't want to think about that, so I focused on the console. No one raised a hand to wave. The workboat edged closer, then fell back, then surged. "Hands to stations," Helen said over the intercom. It sounded like a drill call, neutral and direct. "Deck crew, stand by. No one leaves the rail. If they try to come alongside, use poles. Mateo, raise them." I keyed the radio on channel 16 and called the boat according to position and description because it didn't have a posted name. I invited them to maintain safe distance. No response. The workboat's operator turned again. It's a particular feeling to see someone drive at you at sea. There's nowhere to step off. We didn't have firearms on board before this trip. After the first few days, that changed. I'm not going into details on how or what we had or where we got them. We had tools for defense, and we decided as a group to use them only if we had to. That day, we didn't fire anything. We used the sea. Luis and Miguel handled the stern winch while I ran the controls, and we dropped a weighted trawl door into the water off our starboard quarter. It made a boil and a line in the surface that was visible and very much not something a small boat wanted to cross. The workboat swerved at the last moment, the operator perhaps understanding that our gear could snag his prop. It fell back, then turned away in a wide arc. We kept the trawl door in the water for 10 more minutes and then recovered it. The workboat didn't return. That night we ate rice with fish and sat quiet. Sarah checked pulse rates because that's her way of knowing how people are actually doing. She wrote numbers on a legal pad and then tucked it away when she noticed me watching. Later, she knocked on the bulkhead to the small cabin I shared with Tyler and asked if I was all right. I wanted to say I was tired and we could talk tomorrow. Instead, I told her that I didn't like that my first instinct was to look for a weapon when I saw another boat, and that this felt like the kind of thing you should mention to someone who keeps an eye on where a crew is drifting mentally. She said she didn't like it either, and that it would be strange if we liked it. On day 12, we took a risk. We'd heard a scratchy broadcast about a shelter in a coastal school gym near Florence, Oregon. The message was a day old. We were careful about old information because old information had a way of turning into bait for people who wanted what you had. But it was a town with a marina and fuel, and we had to try somewhere. We approached the Swisslaw River entrance at first light. The bar was manageable. The marina docks were wrong. Boats moored 3 deep where there weren't enough cleats, lines cut and floating, bumpers out at odd angles, On the breakwater, someone had spray painted the word safe in large block letters, and then someone else, or maybe the same person later, had painted over it in black. We pushed in slowly. We saw two figures at the end of the outer dock. They wore bright rain jackets and raised hands high and waved the way people do when they want help. We didn't go to them. We went to the fuel dock. The fuel pump was dead. The marina office door was open and the interior looked tossed. On the far dock, beyond the figures waving, I saw 3 people move out from behind a stack of crab pots. One moved wrong. That stop-start-skip that ruins the normal rhythm of a person walking. The waving figures didn't look at those 3. They kept looking at us. We backed out. The wake pushed the floating debris aside in a parted V, and then it slid back together. "Next inlet down," Helen said, and no one argued. We learned to think in miles instead of days because miles matched fuel, and fuel matched whether we could be picky. We made a pattern. We stayed offshore by day, fishing sometimes, drifting sometimes. At night we angled away from the coast and ran slow to keep the swell on our quarter, where it was easier on the hull. We limited radio call. We watched for nav lights and avoided them. We learned to check every deck latch twice, because an open locker in a hard roll is a curse. We also learned that quarantine was not an idea for other people. Luis took a deep cut on his forearm during a rough sea day while clearing a blocked scupper with a pry bar. Sarah cleaned it with what we had and started him on antibiotics to prevent a regular infection, because that's what still existed alongside the outbreak. She also set up a quarantine routine because he'd been topside near a marina with people a day before, and even though none of us had obvious symptoms, she treated proximity like data that mattered. Luis wasn't happy about being kept in the spare cabin and delivered meals like a guest neither wanted to host nor to be. He stayed there anyway because the rule was the rule and because he respected Sarah. The storm that changed everything arrived on a day that looked fine. The marine forecast said scattered showers and a small craft advisory for inland waters. Offshore, winds were 10 knots in the morning. By early afternoon, dark lines marched in from the west, and the whitecaps went from decoration to texture. We reduced speed and altered for deeper water, where the waves were more even. Near sunset, a squall hit hard. The bow slammed and the starboard side shook in a way that made Dima look up from his open panel. We heard the report before we understood the damage, a crack like an aluminum bat against a railing, and then a vibration in the deck through the balls of our feet. The mast had taken a stress load we didn't anticipate, and the top section bent. The VHF antenna snapped where it met the mount. Our primary radio lost 10 dB of reach in 1 second. We still had an HF set and a backup VHF with a deck whip, but the range and clarity were worse. We secured what we could, lashed the remaining mast section with spare lines, and rode the storm under bare minimum power until the worst went by. The lightning hung far away like a silent film. Rain moved sideways. In the morning, the sky was exhausted, and so were we. "We'll need a rig big enough to go up and a sea flat enough to stay up," I said, staring at the bent mast. "Not today," Helen said. "Let's just make the boat steady." 2 days later, we saw the platform. It wasn't much, an old oil service platform, one of the small ones used for research or staging, anchored in state waters on an old lease that never produced. On the chart, it was a black dot with the word structure. On the sea, it was a squat steel rectangle with a faded helipad and a deck house the size of a trailer. There were drums lashed against the rail with sun-bleached straps. We circled once at a respectful distance. No flags, no movement, no boats. The platform had a ladder that hung from one corner down to water level. "Fuel," Dima said. It sounded the way a person says the name of a friend who moved away and might come back. "Or trouble," Jin said. "Or both," Sarah said. We made a plan that we had no right to be good at, and then we executed it like we'd practiced it 100 times. We didn't carry sidearms openly until then. That morning, we did. We rigged fenders because steel against steel clangs and clangs carry. We drifted with the current and came alongside the ladder with a hand on the engine and a hand on the bow thruster toggle. Luis and I went up first wearing PFDs and gloves. Sarah watched us through binoculars and held a long pole like a pike in case someone uninvited tried to come down the ladder fast. Dima waited on deck with empty fuel hoses coiled and a rolling drum ready to receive what we could move if we found anything useful. Captain kept the throttle and kept the bow kissed to the platform just hard enough to resist drift. Tyler stood with a boat hook to fend off if we needed to push away. Miguel watched the ladder and the water. Jin watched everything else. The platform deck was deserted. The drums were labelled diesel, some marked with dates from a year ago, some with no marking at all. Inside the deck house, we found a dead inverter, a mess table with decks of cards, and a whiteboard that had weather notes from months ago. No one else. No noise except the slap of water on steel. "Check for water in the diesel," Dima said over the handheld when we reported the find. We opened a drum and used a thief to pull a sample. It smelled right and looked right. No obvious water layer, no algae stringers. We still ran it through a filter funnel and waited a full 2 minutes to watch for separation. Nothing. We filled one drum from another until we had 200 gallons we trusted. We rolled it to the ladder and slung it with a rope bridle while the crew below steadied it. We didn't take more than that because it felt like taking more than that would be the point where luck would notice us. Then Tyler shouted from our rail. We looked down. He pointed at the platform's deckhouse door. A man stood there, disoriented like he'd just woken. He was barefoot. His eyes were unfocused and then too focused. He moved toward us in a twitching lunge, hit his shoulder on the jam, recovered, and moved again faster. I'd seen that gate through binoculars on shore. It's different when it comes at you at arm's length. We didn't shoot. We used what we said we would use. Luis held the long pole and met the man at the rail as he surged. He pushed him back with force that surprised me, and the man slid across the deck and hit the other rail. He rose instantly and came on again with the same blank insistence, silent except for breath. The pole met him again. His hands clawed at the wood. He wasn't a problem we could talk down or argue with. He wasn't a problem we could pretend wasn't a problem. "Back down," Captain said, and we obeyed. We left the remaining drums. We left the cards on the table. We untied and drifted off and didn't look like heroes because we weren't. When we were safely off, we had 200 gallons in our tank we didn't have before, and a reminder that every place we could go had stopped being normal in the same way. That fuel bought us range, and range bought us options we could argue about at night instead of letting fear do our thinking. We marked the platform in the plotter as Diesel 1, and we gave it a wide berth if we had to pass that way again. 2 weeks at sea hardened our routines into culture. We scheduled dark hours when no one spoke above a whisper. We learned each other's tells. Dima's tell was that he hummed quietly when he was solving a mechanical puzzle. Sarah's was that she asked 3 normal questions before she asked the hard one. Jin's was that he tapped the edge of the chart screen twice when he saw a target he didn't like. Luis and Miguel had no tells I could read. The brothers seemed to save their conversations for each other in a Spanish that ran fast and tight between them. Captain's tell was that she didn't lean on the armrest at all when she was fully present. Tyler's tell was that he apologized in advance for anything he thought he might do wrong. We also, finally, started talking about a place to stop. The ocean is big, but a boat is small, and we were not a submarine. We needed lines we could tie and ground underfoot that could hold a fence. If we kept cruising until the diesel bled dry and the batteries dropped to nothing and the nets rotted, we would have a problem that no plan could fix. We studied charted islands the way people study real estate. We wanted an island with fresh water, a defensible anchorage, and some shelter. We didn't want a tourist island with marinas that would draw desperate traffic. We wanted a forgotten island that someone used to care about long enough to build something we could repair. There were not many. On the 42nd day, north of Cape Mendocino, we saw a lighthouse on a low, hard island and a shape beside it that Jin swore looked like old gun emplacements from a photo he remembered in a book about coastal defences. The chart labelled the place simply with a name I won't write here. It lay a couple of miles offshore and had no marina. The lighthouse was decommissioned. The island had a low cove on the lee side when the wind blew from the northwest, which is most of the time in summer. The water was deep enough close in to make a sheltered anchorage if a person was careful. It looked like a place to tie our future to. We watched it for a day from outside the 2-mile line with binoculars and with the zoom function on a camera I had in a drawer for a hobby I no longer had time for. We saw no movement. We saw no smoke. We saw cormorants and gulls and a group of seals hauled out on the rocky shelf. We saw a rusty landing crane on the old service pier. We saw 2 concrete structures on the hill behind the lighthouse, low and square, the kind that could be bunkers or pump houses, or both. We saw a steel door at the base of the lighthouse keeper's cottage. "Approach tomorrow," Helen said. "We'll do it on a flood tide and under sun." We woke earlier than we needed to. Dima checked the pumps twice. Sarah laid out a medical kit that looked like she was expecting both a sprained ankle and a broken bone. I secured radios with fresh waterproof tape at the connector points and checked the spare handheld batteries. Luis and Miguel rigged lines so fast they forgot to talk to each other. Tyler asked whether we should bring the long pole and then brought it without waiting for an answer. We approached from leeward. The island's lee cove was as calm as it had looked, and the surge at the old pier was less than a foot. We didn't tie the boat to a dock that looked like it hadn't been tested in a decade. We dropped anchor in 20 feet of water and set it well, then ran a stern line to a rock ring on the lower pier so the boat wouldn't yaw. We launched the dinghy, a rigid-hulled inflatable that used to ferry crew to the dock when we wanted to stretch after long runs. I went ashore with Jin and Luis. We carried packs with water and radios, a small toolkit, and the kind of quiet determination you get after you've talked a plan to death, and it's time to see if it was any good. The old pier creaked but held. The path up to the lighthouse was a concrete ribbon with weeds reclaiming edges. The keeper's cottage door was locked, but weather-rotted. We forced it with a pry bar carefully, not because we loved the door, but because noise in a new place is a kind of announcement. The interior smelled like old sea and old paper. There were shelves with dust-coated logbooks and a table with a chipped enamel basin. We cleared each room by the belt and suspenders method. One person enters with another at shoulder. The third covers the hall. Slow steps, look low and look high. We saw no one. We did see a hatch in the floor of the back room, half hidden by a rug. It had a loop handle and newer screws than the rest of the cottage hardware. The hatch led to a narrow stair down into a cool concrete corridor. The air was still and dry and smelled faintly of old oil. We walked single file. After 10 steps, the corridor widened into a chamber with 2 doors. One was marked generator. The other had no sign, but had an electrical conduit entering at the top and exiting farther down. I heard the memory of fans in that space, even though there was only silence. We turned the generator room door handle. Inside was a small diesel generator with a hand primer on the fuel line and a start panel that looked 70s vintage but intact. The fuel tank was small and the gauge read near E. On a shelf near the back wall, behind a dusty tarp, we found 4 5-gallon jerry cans labelled diesel in marker that had not faded fully. There were also 2 old air filters and a stack of belts and a box of fuses. It looked like the last caretaker hadn't left in a rush. They'd organised this room like they expected to return from lunch. The unmarked door led to a corridor with vent dampers. It ran toward the hill. At the end, a steel blast door stood open. Beyond it, a concrete chamber opened with 2 side rooms. On the floor, chalk marks indicated measurements for shelving. On one wall, someone had stenciled Battery A and Battery B with arrows pointing to conduit runs. It was not a military bunker in the cinematic sense. It was a utility space. But the walls were thick, the doors were strong, and the tunnels had only one way in from this cottage side. We didn't know yet if there was another entrance elsewhere on the island. We had found the bones of a place, We brought the rest of the crew ashore in 2 more dinghy runs. Dima went straight to the generator and inspected it like a veterinarian checking a horse's teeth. Sarah checked the cottage and declared it usable with cleaning and a little cloth and bleach effort. Tyler kept opening the freezer and closing it like he expected ice cream. There wasn't ice cream. There was a bag of old bait that we threw into the sea for the seals. Captain stood at the cottage door and didn't say anything for a while. When she did, it was to divide us into teams. Team 1 sets up a perimeter, clear the lighthouse, check the hill, look for any other structures. Team 2 checks all doors and windows and makes sure the cottage can lock from the inside. Team 3 inventories what we have here without moving anything. No one goes out of sight of another person. Radios stay on. We went up the hill. The concrete structures above were exactly what they looked like from the water. 2 fire control bunkers from the Second World War era, designed to direct coastal artillery that was no longer present. The doors were rusted and partly jammed. Inside, there were empty rooms, dusty but solid, with narrow firing slits that faced the sea. The roofs were reinforced concrete 2 feet thick, a place that wouldn't care about weather. The narrow galleries could be barricaded. On the far side of the hill, we found a slit trench and a collapsed communications hut. We found no fresh tracks, no signs of cooking fires, no cloth scraps or bottles. The place looked like a museum had closed, and no one came to reopen it. We moved cautiously for 2 days. We slept on the boat at anchor and came ashore during light hours. We cleaned without raising plumes of dust we'd regret breathing. We tested the generator with 5 minutes of runtime. It started, sputtered, then settled. We shut it down. We mapped the tunnels in a notebook and measured every door that needed a brace. We hauled water from the boat and set it inside. We took nothing for granted and nothing for free. On the 3rd day, late morning, 3 people arrived in a small open boat and changed our timeline. They came around the north side of the island and angled into the cove badly, new to handling a boat in surge. 2 were men, 1 older, 1 no older than 20. The 3rd was a woman, mid-30s. They had the look of people who had been in sun and wind and needed to sit down without announcing it. The older man stood and held both hands up, palms out in a gesture that doesn't help if someone is determined to be hostile, but helps if someone is deciding. We didn't raise weapons. We didn't wave. We didn't approach until Captain was at my shoulder and nodded once. "We need water," the older man said when the boats were within normal voice range. "We saw your boat and the lighthouse. We've got 2 kids hiding on the outside of the cove. They're scared. We're not looking to take anything." He didn't look like a bandit. He looked like a retired teacher or a mechanic with a sunburn. But the workboat with no name had taught us that an angle of approach and a calm voice don't guarantee anything. We followed the script we'd rehearsed. 2 of us stayed on the dock with hands visible and calm. 2 others stayed 10 yards above with rifles slung down, not pointed. Sarah came forward and asked them to slow down and give names. The man said his name was Bernard. The younger man was named Alex. The woman was named Kendra. They said they were from a small town inland, made it to the coast 3 weeks ago, and then had been living on a mooring in a sheltered bay until their water ran low. "Kids?" Sarah asked, because she thinks in terms that put kids ahead of everything else. The woman called gently, and a boy and a girl appeared around the headland. They were maybe 8 and 10. They looked dehydrated and wary. Any plan for a cold refusal melted because we were not going to send kids back out thirsty when we had a working still and a plan to hook up a cistern in the cottage. We brought them all ashore. We didn't invite them into the cottage. We set them on the pier where they could sit with bare feet in the sweep of cool water between swells. We handed them clean plastic cups with the water that had cost us hours of attention and copper coil polishing. They drank, and in those moments, we chose a different direction than the one we would have taken if we had decided to become a boat that lived like a submarine. They asked to stay the night on the far side of the cove, on the rocks, within view. We agreed because it was a way to help without handing over the keys to what we were building. At dusk, the boy fell asleep, sitting up against his sister, and the adults sat quiet and looked at the lighthouse like it was a fire they could trust. We posted a double watch. When the incident happened that forced us to say the word quarantine out loud with the finality of a door closing, it happened in a way that was almost boring. We were at the base of the lighthouse installing a stronger brace across the tunnel entrance. Miguel slipped on the concrete and cut his palm on a rusty bolt. Sarah cleaned it and closed it with strips and gave him a tetanus booster from the boat's medic kit. It wasn't the cut, it was the memory, the platform, the man with the wrong gait, the way a cut fed fear like a rumour. Sarah looked at us and didn't ask permission. We isolate Miguel for 24 hours. He was never in contact with unwell people. He didn't go near the visitors. He worked here. This is precaution. He'll be fine. He knows the rule. We all know the rule, she said. Miguel didn't argue. He went into the small room we designated for quarantine with a mattress and a light and said he was tired anyway. He did not like the door being closed, but he liked the reason. He joked through the door that at least he could avoid scrubbing pots for a day. We laughed because that's what you do when the only other option is less useful. We had nearly convinced ourselves that the island could be ours when the signal came, that reminded us that the rest of the world still existed, even if we had walled ourselves in. I had the HF set brushed up with a new ground plane and a jury-rigged wire antenna that I'd strung from the cottage roof to the lighthouse bracket. At night, I swept bands and listened to thin voices cut through the atmospheric noise. Some nights, I heard an amateur in Idaho talking to his own echo. Some nights, I heard nothing but static. One night I heard a clear, steady voice repeat coordinates and say, "Rendezvous at dawn," followed by a list of call signs. It sounded like an organized group. The next night I heard the same voice again with new coordinates a few miles from our island. It could have been coincidence. It could have been someone trying to draw boats. It could have been both. We did not go to the rendezvous at dawn. We used those coordinates as a warning instead. We chose that day to move caches from the dinghy landing inside and to shift the boat's anchoring so we had an easier angle for a fast exit if we had to. Captain modified our watch plan to include a listener on the HF set who knew enough not to answer. Jin scanned the horizon constantly. Dima primed the generator, checked the belt tension one more time, and told me not to touch his tools. The group revealed itself in late afternoon. 3 boats rounded the southern tip of the island and entered the cove in a formation that was casual but practiced. 2 were small cabin cruisers. 1 was an open workboat. They came in without calling on the radio. They drifted near the pier and watched us. The younger one on the bow of the lead boat had a hand on a coil of line like this was all very normal. "Afternoon," the man on the aft deck of the middle boat called, like a neighbour asking how the barbecue was going. "Nice spot. We'll tie up." "This is a private facility," Helen said, using a voice like she was reading chart notes. "We are not taking visitors. Please move along." "Water," the man said. "We heard you have some." "We work for our water," Sarah said. "We don't give it away. There are safer places for you down the coast." "Everything safer ran out," the man said. It wasn't a threat. It was a complaint. He took a step toward the railing to toss his line to the pier. Miguel and Luis stood with pikes visible. I stood with a radio and a camera because sometimes a camera is a kind of boundary that says we see you and you can be seen later by others. Dima stood near the generator hatch. Jin stood on a rock above with a line tied around his waist for ridiculous reasons we could justify only if he needed to move fast. "Stand off," Captain said. It wasn't a shout. It had a note in it that anyone who's worked on a deck recognizes as the last line before no more lines. The man's lip twitched, like he was calculating a different approach. He raised both hands like he had nothing in them and gestured to the open water behind him, like he was asking us to consider the big picture. He took one step onto his gunwale. He began a speech I have heard versions of since, the speech that says we're all people, and we have to help each other, and we will help you too, later, after we have something of yours. Before he finished, the open workboat grazed our stern line and rocked hard. The young man on its bow grabbed for balance and made the mistake of seizing our stern line with both hands. Luis and I both reacted out of training. We didn't mean to be rough. We meant to keep him from climbing. Luis jabbed the pike down to separate his hands. The young man let go instantly and fell backward into his boat. The older man on the other boat stopped speaking. He looked at our faces. He looked at the steel door to the tunnel entrance. He decided he wasn't interested in a day that ended in a way he didn't control. He raised his hands again, still open, a silent acknowledgement, and motioned with a small tilt of fingers to the workboat helm. The 3 boats backed water, turned inside the cove with competence that confirmed what we already knew, that they were not newbies, and headed out. We watched them until they rounded the headland. We did not talk for a minute. Tyler exhaled loudly like he had been holding breath since dawn. The kids on the rock shelf with Kendra and Bernard stared at us. The boy put his head against Kendra's side and stayed there the rest of the hour. That night, we didn't light anything that could be seen from outside the cottage. We rotated 3 people on watch instead of 2. We heard distant engines twice before midnight and then nothing. In the morning, we found footprints in the sand on the far side of the island, not near the cove, not near the pier, but near a rocky cut where a person with a small inflatable could beach for a moment. The prints were not ours. We followed them for 20 yards until they vanished on stone. We made a decision that day that was less about anger and more about math. We could not defend the whole island with 8 and 2 guests and 2 kids. We could defend a corridor and a door. We moved inland. We shifted our base inside the cottage and the tunnels. We installed braces on the steel door hinges, and we built 2 internal gates with chain link and 2x4s that would slow anyone who didn't have tools or didn't have time. We turned the old generator room into a power room with a battery bank we stole from our own boat's spares and from 2 solar kits Jin had bought for camping years ago and never used. We carried the solar panels up to the bunker roof and laid them flat with low profile and painted the wire runs the same grey as the concrete. We set up a water collection system off the cottage roof with a first flush diverter and a tank we found behind one of the bunkers. We tested the tank for leaks and found none. We flushed it anyway and filled with distilled water for a start. We took the boat out at night and moved it half a mile offshore on a long anchor, and we rigged a line that ran from the bow to a small ring set in the cliff so we could draw ourselves in with a hand-powered capstan if we needed to come quick and leave quick. We stopped burning deck lights at night, and we stopped using the galley as if we were day tripping. We also set a rule for guests because rules keep people from inventing their own. Short-term assistance for water and medical, yes. Long-term residency, no, unless voted by the 8 of us. Quarantine for all visitors for 24 hours before any inside passage. No exceptions. We wrote the rules on a board inside the cottage and on a weatherproof slate at the bottom of the pier ladder. We hoped the slate would act as a kind filter. Some people would respect a posted rule, others would laugh, and the ones who laughed were the ones we didn't want inside anyway. We lasted like that for a week, then the week ended in a way every plan does at sea, with something you did not plan. We had spotted clouds charging in from the northwest in a stacked formation that meant sustained wind and messy swell. We decided to move the boat into the cove early, to ride it there on a bow and stern anchor like a cat's cradle. We had just hauled the dinghy up when a skiff came around the north headland at speed. The driver cut throttle late and the bow slapped the water hard twice in a way that would have tossed me overboard if I had been standing up. The passenger in the bow waved both arms. "Help!" he shouted, but not the way people shout for help when they want you to do everything for them. There was a note of apology in it. "Please, we were stupid. He got bitten." It is a word we had avoided saying directly in that exact form, because saying it makes it a law. Sara moved forward before anyone else could, because she moves toward pain, even when pain is a warning. I reached out and grabbed her sleeve. She looked at me in surprise. I let go and stepped in front of her, as if that would change the path of the day. "Stay there," I said to the men in the skiff. "Turn off the engine. Hands where we can see them. Tell me what happened, and tell me slow." They turned off the engine. They held up their hands. The man in the bow said they had gone ashore south of here 2 nights ago to look for supplies in a village, and had encountered a man who lunged from behind a fence and bit his partner on the forearm through a jacket before they could run. They had wrapped the arm and set out for our island because they had seen our boat on previous days at distance and put together that we were living here. They knew our rules better than we liked. The man in the stern held out his arm and showed a bandage that was too clean to have been changed by someone who knew how to clean a wound properly. It had a dark patch because bandages always do when they cover something that should be looked at instead of covered. I looked at Sarah. She was already shaking her head very slightly, not about the man, but at me, because she had already decided she needed to examine the wound closer or she would never sleep again. We followed our own rules. We set up the quarantine tent on the pier. It was a heavy canvas tent with screened windows, and we had never liked the smell of it because it smelled like linseed oil mixed with memory. We put the injured man inside with water and a bedroll, and we set his friend right outside on a stool. Sarah went in with full precautions and the small sterile kit. She came out after 10 minutes and closed the flap and stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the ocean as if it would answer. Then she turned and spoke to the friend in a voice that had no drama in it. She laid out what would happen, how his friend needed quiet and a cool cloth, and that we would not permit anyone to enter the tent except one of us, not even him. Not until the observation period ended. She asked his friend for a full history of what happened. He complied. He asked if we could please let him sit nearer to the flap. She said he could sit near but not touch. He cried. Not because he was told no, but because being told no in a voice that is kind can make a person drop their guard in a way that hurts more than being shouted at. We took turns sitting watch near the tent, not with weapons out, but with calm discipline. The storm rolled over the island that night, and rain drummed the tent and the roof and made the tunnels sound like they were underwater. The wind blew through cracks we had not found yet, and rattled a loose piece of flashing on the cottage eave until Dimer climbed up with a headlamp and a spare screw and silenced it in gusts. The next day, the wind eased and small birds returned to peck at the wet grass. The injured man slept through most of the morning. He woke around noon and asked for water. Sarah gave him a little. He smiled in thanks. He slept again. At dusk, his breathing changed, and then changed again in a way that made us decide faster than we wanted. We followed our rule without delay. We did not allow a second chance after the line we had drawn. We used restraints and we used caution, and we used no more force than we needed. We don't tell the details of that part when we tell this story to others later, because that's not the part that will help them do the right thing under pressure. The part that helps is the rule and the decision, and the calm voice, and the fact that we did not argue while the argument would have cost us what we were building. Afterward, the friend sat on the stool with his head in his hands for an hour. He asked us if he could still have water, and, when we said yes, he thanked us like we had given him a house. He slept in the open by the tent that night because he did not want to leave the place where his friend had been. In the morning, he asked whether he could stay on the far side of the cove for a few days and help with whatever needed doing in exchange for the supplies we would give him to continue on. We said yes. He worked like a man who wanted his hands to be tired enough not to shake. From then on, the island was not a refuge in the simple way we had hoped. It was a project and a perimeter and a test of whether 8 people who had been thrown together for a job could become a town. We wrote a schedule on the wall of the corridor in pencil and updated it with a new eraser stub every evening after dinner. Morning duty rotated. 2 on watch, 2 on water, 2 on maintenance, 1 at the radio, 1 on galley. We kept a log of every boat we saw and every call we heard. We logged the weather because weather is part of a person's mental health, even when it doesn't take the roof off. We instituted quiet hours at midday because noise carries weird in heat. We ate together, standing sometimes, because chairs can make people settle into grooves that are hard to climb out of. When the question finally came that we had been avoiding since the first day offshore, whether to keep moving or to build a home on this island, we had a vote. It was not a formal ballot. It was Captain asking each of us in a circle to say where we were. Jin chose the island with qualifiers about exit routes and fuel levels. Dima chose the island because engines like rest as much as men do. Sarah chose the island because quarantine is possible in a place with doors. Luis and Miguel chose the island because they had grown up in a city where you learned that four walls are more defendable than none. Tyler said he would go with whatever the others decided, and then blushed when Sarah said that was not a vote, but a weather report. I said yes to the island because I did not want to die of a hydraulic leak at sea in a storm when I could die of something I understood more fully on land. Captain listened and then nodded. Island then, she said, but not forever. We set a 90-day plan. If in 90 days we can't make this self-sustaining, we start moving again before we trap ourselves. We carve the date in the wall so we don't forget. We carved the date in the wall. We set to work on a bigger still, using the generator's waste heat. We built a small garden on the lee side in boxes made of planks pried from a collapsed outbuilding, filled with soil we ferried in flattened tubs from the far side, where wind had built drifts behind rocks. It was not enough to feed us. It was enough to remind us that growth is not only a word in a book. We rigged a rain catchment off the bunker roof, added a mesh screen, and learned how often to clean it before algae became a problem. We rotated the solar panels 30 degrees seasonally because an old manual said it mattered. We built a simple radio schedule. 3 times a day, listen only, scan the frequencies we knew, plus one new one in case someone invented a better idea. We never broadcast from home. We kept our transmissions for offshore whenever possible. We lived that way for weeks and then months. We fished on a schedule that matched fuel, using long lines which were easier on fuel than trawls. We bartered with 2 other small groups who respected our rules and returned as promised. We sent Kendra and Bernard and the kids south during a safe weather window on a boat we adjusted for better balance with the extra water they carried. Bernard hugged each of us like a person who knows what a favor is and how to hold it. The kids waved and the girl held a shell she had found and showed it to me like a passport. We watched their boat until it was a dot and then not even that. On the 80th day after landfall, the work we had done met the worst day we had seen. It started with a hum in the HF set that was more than atmospheric noise. It had a pattern. It took me 10 minutes of listening to realize it was a data burst. That meant someone had either a modem rebuilt from parts or a device built to talk to anyone who still had an ear to hear. Once I heard it every hour. I catalogued the frequency and wrote the timestamps. At noon, the data burst stopped and a recorded voice came on and announced a humanitarian corridor for small craft between 2 offshore buoys 30 miles south. It listed time windows and said medical screening would be conducted before entry and that vessels would be refueled if they complied with screening. If we had heard that a month earlier, we would have pushed south at once. Now we did not trust anything that sounded like it required us to tie up in daylight amid others who wanted the same things we wanted. We listened. We did not move. We watched. At the second scheduled window, we could see a smudge on the horizon that was not weather. Through the binoculars, I saw a cluster of small craft milling between 2 points that could have been offshore buoys or could have been arbitrary flags. I saw a larger steel hull further out that looked like a research vessel or a retired Coast Guard buoy tender. I saw the small craft circle and hesitate and then move forward in a line. I did not see what happened at the front of that line. I did not need to. The next hour's radio traffic made it clear that the corridor was not what it said. By dusk, the survivors of that attempt were scattering up and down the coast. We watched 2 boats pull into coves on either side of us. We went dark. We set a double watch on the cliff path that ran from the far side to the cottage, a path we had walked 100 times and now guarded like a line in a map. A group of 6 came ashore on our north point in early night. They did not try to be quiet. They walked with the looseness of people who believed that their numbers were enough to make someone else's rules irrelevant. They found the path in the dark and approached the cottage. I can summarize that night in one sentence. The gates worked and the door held. I can also say something else that matters more than that summary. We announced ourselves early, and we used words first, and we used non-lethal tools, and we used our lights in ways that made their approach difficult. We told them clearly that they would not be allowed inside, and we told them how they could wait for water at dawn if they wanted it. They did not take the offer. They tried the door. We repelled them. They retreated. They didn't leave right away though. They lingered on the rocks outside and shouted things that had more to do with their day than with ours. Near midnight, a seventh person came up the path and sat apart from their group and spoke in a quiet voice that cut through the insults like a human voice always does when it says something the others aren't saying. She said she had 2 children asleep in their boat and that she would leave at dawn and that she did not want conflict and that she would be grateful for a few gallons of water to make the next port. Captain listened. We debated with our eyes because debate with voices carries. We decided. We lowered a sealed container on a rope from the window above the path, and she took it and thanked us and walked away. Her group went with her at dawn because some people follow the person who asked instead of the person who shouted. On the 89th day, the day before the mark we'd carved in the wall, we reviewed the 90-day plan. It was the best meeting I've ever had because it was honest, and that kind of honesty felt like a rare metal we had mined from our own days. We listed what worked: water, power, doors, lines, rules. We listed what didn't: fuel trend downward, spare parts short for the water pump, garden yield small, medical supplies limited, and no resupply for some essentials. We concluded that we could stay for another 90 days if we accepted that every day after that would put us in a narrower tunnel of options. Or we could leave inside 10 days, while the weather window allowed a clean run to a new island further south, where Jin's book said there were larger bunkers, with a cove that was less exposed and a fresh spring that might still run. The vote had the same tone as the first. We weighed cost and gain, and we did not pretend that there was a right answer. We chose to move. The lighthouse had given us a chance to decide, and we honoured that chance by not clinging to it past its season. We spent 5 days packing. We left the cottage swept, and the generator drained, and the valves closed. We left a message in the logbook that we were real, and that this place could work if a new crew came with respect. We left a small cache of water in a steel locker under a bench with a note on it that said, "Take only what you need. If this helped you, leave the locker closed and the note in place." It wasn't naive. It was a maintenance action on the world. On the 6th day, we broke anchor and raised engine to run south. We slid out under grey sky and a swell that would be gentle by afternoon. I stood at the stern and watched the lighthouse shrink. I saw the concrete bunker outline like a flat tooth against the sky. I didn't wave, because that's not what you do to a building. I touched the rail with my hand, and that was the gesture. We ran with a routine that felt like muscle memory. The smell of diesel and salt mixed in a way that reminded me of the first week at sea when this all started. Only now the radio was not a steady friend, but a contested hallway, and we knew what our hands could do when we needed them to. We ran at 9 knots to save fuel. We slept in a new rotation that allowed for fatigue and didn't punish anyone for being human. We aimed for the island that Jin had circled on a paper chart with a blunt pencil. It had a derelict light and what looked like 2 larger structures inland and what could be a second cove on the far side. It also had a reputation in a guidebook as unfriendly to landing. That was a glowing review for us. Halfway there, on a clean morning when the sea looked like brushed steel, we saw smoke on the horizon, not the thin grey of a cooking fire, and not the black greasy column of a diesel engine fire. It was something in between that suggested a camp on shore had burned and was still smouldering. We altered to give the coast extra distance and scanned for boats. We saw a single sail far to the west, white triangle in a blue field, and we watched it until it had the bearing drift that told us we would never meet. That afternoon, The HF set carried a human voice with a broken signal quality that had less to do with distance than with the piecemeal equipment the voice used. The voice said a simple thing in a calm tone. If you can hear this, you're not alone. If you are safe, teach someone else how you made it so. It didn't ask for names, and it didn't list coordinates. It was somebody's version of us leaving water in a locker. We wrote the frequency on our board, as if we were adding a friend to a directory. As the sun fell low, the island came up on our bow at the range, where details begin to matter. The cove showed itself first in a notch. The old pier looked worse than the one we had used before. The lighthouse was a shorter tower with a square base. The inland structures were larger. There was a second notch on the far side that promised a second way in and a second way out. The sea state on the approach was manageable. The gulls were loud. The radio was quiet. We looked at each other, and we looked at the island, and then we looked at the captain. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Stations," she said. "Let's do this the way we know how." We brought the Marlin's Pride around and eased down our speed, and I took my place with the lines, and Dima listened to the engine like it was trying to tell him a secret. Jin monitored radar and AIS that were both nearly blank in a way that still made me uneasy, even after months of blank. Luis and Miguel stood ready with fenders we had patched 3 times and loved like pets. Tyler stood with the boat hook and did not grip it too hard. Sarah checked our kit and the masks and the gloves, and the words she would use if we met someone who had forgotten how to use theirs. We made our quiet approach. I won't pretend it was not frightening. I won't dress it up in speeches. We had done this before, and we would do it again, at this island, or at another, or back at sea if the island refused us. The epidemic had turned the world inside out. The sea had made us a crew, and then a small town, with a charter we wrote on a corridor wall. We had learned to move toward work and away from noise. We had learned that rules keep the door closed when it needs to be closed, and open when it needs to be open. We had learned that you can live on a boat long enough that the deck feels like ground, and the ground feels like a guess. We had learned to do our work in daylight, and then go below and write what mattered. We eased into the cove, and I could see the shape of the old bunker door. I could see a rusted crane. I could see a trail up the hill that looked like it had been cleared not long ago, which meant someone else had eyes on this place. We stayed steady. We kept to our plan. We had 90 days of new decisions ahead, and that was the only way to travel without losing yourself. One decision at a time, written on a wall, read out loud, and kept. When we cut the engine and the boat slid the last few feet on momentum, the quiet was a kind we could live with. The boat was our lifeline and our prison. It was also our way to carry one truth from one cove to the next. The sea both isolates and saves, and the people on one deck can decide which version of that sentence they want to live inside. We chose the one with doors that open and close on purpose. We chose the one with rules written where anyone can see them. We chose the one where we teach what we know to the next boat that eases in with fenders ready and eyes open. And if the next island doesn't say yes, we'll point the bow south again and do it all over, because staying alive in this new chart is less about luck than about staying with your crew long enough to build the next corridor and close the next door gently behind you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.